George Merritt buried his wife on a Friday. By Sunday, his children were already in the house. Not to comfort him, not to sit with him in the particular silence that follows a funeral, when the casseroles from neighbors are still on the counter and the sympathy cards are still in their envelopes, and a man doesn't quite know how to exist in a house that still smells like the person who just left it. They came with boxes. Sandra, his eldest, arrived first. She went straight to the bedroom and started opening drawers. George stood in the doorway and watched her fold Eleanor's sweaters into a cardboard box and couldn't find a single word. "These should go to Goodwill," Sandra said. "No point letting them sit." Eleanor had been in the ground 48 hours. His son Robert came that afternoon with a notepad. He walked through the house writing things down. The dining room set, the china cabinet, the antique clock on the mantel that Eleanor's mother had brought from Georgia in 1958. Robert wrote it all down with the focused efficiency of a man taking inventory, which was exactly what he was doing. George sat in his armchair and watched his children move through 53 years of his life like they were clearing out a storage unit. He thought about Eleanor, about how she used to say, "George, the kids will be fine. We raised them right." He hoped she couldn't see this. By Sunday evening, 3 boxes were stacked by the front door and Robert had taken photographs of the furniture for insurance purposes, and Sandra had mentioned twice that the house was really too big for one person. George said nothing. He was 77 years old and he had just buried his wife and his children were already dividing the estate, and he didn't have the strength to stop them. George Merritt had worked 50 years at the same manufacturing plant in Dayton, Ohio. Started on the floor at 22, retired as floor supervisor at 72. 50 years of early mornings in safety boots and the particular smell of metal and machine oil that never fully washed out of his clothes. Eleanor used to joke that she could find him in a crowd blindfolded. He'd done it for them. That was the truth of it. For Sandra's college tuition, for Robert's business loan when his first venture failed, $40,000, never repaid, never mentioned again. For the grandchildren's Christmas presents every year without fail, for the family vacations, for every time one of them called with a problem that money could solve. George solved it. That was his role. That was who he was. Eleanor managed everything else. The warmth, the dinners, the phone calls, the emotional gravity that held the family in orbit. George provided the fuel. Together they made something that worked. Without Eleanor, George was just a man with a savings account and a house full of furniture his children were already photographing. He'd noticed things over the years, small things he'd told himself didn't mean anything. The way Robert's visits always seemed to include a casual mention of the house's value. The way Sandra had asked twice in the last year whether George had updated his will. He'd told himself they were being practical, responsible. He understood now they had been preparing. He sat in the kitchen the Monday after the funeral and drank his coffee alone for the first time in 53 years. Eleanor's mug was still on the drying rack. He couldn't bring himself to put it away. Outside, the morning was gray and ordinary. The world had no idea what had just happened to George Merritt. The world didn't particularly care. He drank his coffee and tried to figure out what came next. 3 weeks after the funeral, Robert sat across from George at the kitchen table with a folder. George looked at the folder, then at his son. Robert was 51. He had George's broad shoulders but none of his patience. He'd always moved fast, decisions, plans, outcomes. Eleanor used to say Robert came out of the womb with a to-do list. "I want to talk about the house," Robert said. "I know," George said. "It's a lot for one person, Dad. Maintenance alone. I've maintained this house for 30 years, Robert." "I know, but..." Robert opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, real estate listings, The market is really strong right now. You could get significantly over asking. Take that money, move somewhere smaller, easier. A senior community maybe. You'd have people around. I don't want people around, George said. I want my house. Robert pressed his lips together, the expression he'd made since childhood when he thought George was being unreasonable. Sandra agrees with me, Robert said. Sandra isn't on the deed, George said. Silence. Robert closed the folder slowly. We're just trying to help. Are you? George said. It wasn't a question. Robert left an hour later. The folder stayed on the table. George noticed he didn't take it with him. Left it there like a seed, like he expected George to sit alone and eventually come around. George picked it up and put it in the recycling bin. Then he called his neighbor Frank, who was 79 and had been through something similar 3 years ago, and asked if he wanted to come over for coffee. Frank came. They sat on the back porch and didn't talk about children at all. That was the best hour George had spent in weeks. Frank DeLuca was 79 years old and had the particular wisdom of a man who had already survived what George was currently going through. He'd lost his wife Agnes in 2019. His son had moved him into an assisted living facility 8 months later. Not cruelly, Frank always said, just practically. Frank had lasted 14 months before his daughter in Portland had driven down and brought him home with her. Here's what nobody tells you, Frank said, coffee mug in both hands, looking out at George's yard. The first year they feel guilty, so they overcompensate. They make decisions for you because making decisions feels like helping. It lets them feel like good children without actually sitting with you in the hard part. George thought about the folder in the recycling bin. And after the first year, he asked. Depends on the kids, Frank said honestly. Some of them come back to themselves, realize what they were doing. My daughter did. Took her about 18 months. And the ones who don't? Frank was quiet for a moment. A bird landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and then was gone. Then you find out who you are without them propping you up, Frank said. And that's hard, but it's not the end. George looked at Eleanor's garden, overgrown now, just 3 weeks without her and already losing its shape. She'd have hated that. He made a mental note to get out there this weekend, not because he had any idea how to garden, just because she'd have wanted it kept. You think they know what they're doing to me? George asked. Frank considered it seriously. I think they know and they don't know at the same time. People are good at not knowing the things that are inconvenient to know. George nodded slowly. Come back tomorrow, he said. I'll make the coffee again. Frank smiled. I'll bring the rolls. George spent Saturday in the garden. He didn't know what he was doing. That was the honest truth. Eleanor had been the gardener. George had been the man who occasionally carried bags of mulch and was told where to put them, but he'd watched her for 53 years and some of it had settled in somewhere without him realizing. He pulled weeds for 2 hours. His knees ached and his back told him things he didn't want to hear. He kept going. Sandra called while he was on his knees in the dirt. He almost didn't answer, then did. Dad, what are you doing? She could hear him breathing hard. Gardening. A pause. You don't garden. Eleanor did, he said. Someone has to. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I could come next weekend, she said finally. Her voice had shifted, something softer underneath it. Help you figure out what's what. I used to help Mom sometimes. George sat back on his heels and looked at the garden. Uneven, imperfect, his clumsy attempt at preservation. That would be all right, he said carefully. Dad, Sandra stopped. Started again. I know the last few weeks haven't been. I know Robert and I have been. Another stop. Mom would have told us to slow down. Yes, George said. She would have. I'm sorry, Sandra said quietly. I think we got scared and turned it into logistics. George looked at Eleanor's roses, wild now, reaching past the trellis. She planted those in 1987, he said. The roses. Robert had just started middle school. I remember, Sandra said, and her voice cracked just slightly. I remember. They stayed on the phone a while longer, saying nothing much, just present with each other across the distance. It was the first time since the funeral that George didn't feel entirely alone. Sandra came the following Saturday. She brought Robert. George hadn't expected that. He'd steeled himself for Sandra, had not prepared for both of them standing on his porch at 9 in the morning, Robert holding a tray of coffees from the place down the road and looking like a man who had rehearsed something and forgotten half of it. Frank let us in the gate, Sandra said. George looked past them and saw Frank waving from his driveway with the satisfied expression of a man who had arranged something. George made a mental note to thank him. Later, they worked in the garden all morning. Sandra actually knew what she was doing. She'd retained more from Eleanor than she'd let on. Robert was useless with plants but carried things and did not complain, and at one point got on his knees in the dirt to help George pull a root that had gone deep. At lunch they sat on the back porch with sandwiches. Robert put the folder on the table. George looked at it. I went through the recycling, Robert said. Not defensive, just honest. I want to say something about this. George waited. I wasn't trying to take care of you, Robert said slowly. I was trying to not feel helpless. Mom died and I didn't know what to do with that, so I turned it into a project. He looked at the folder. That was wrong. This is your house. You built your life here. I had no right. George looked at his son, 51 years old. Eleanor's eyes. A good man who had gotten scared and handled it badly, same as men do. No, George said. You didn't. I know. They sat with that for a moment. The garden around them, imperfect, recovering, still full of what Eleanor had planted. Some things outlast the people who made them. The roses were proof of that. George picked up his sandwich. Eat, he said. Then we've got more weeding to do. Robert almost smiled. Yes, sir. George looked at his yard. Eleanor's roses climbing the trellis, his children beside him, Frank waving again from over the fence like the old fool he was. It wasn't what it used to be. It would never be what it used to be, but it was still something. Still his. Still worth tending. That was enough for today. And today for George Merritt was enough.